Good evening. I want to welcome you to the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. I'm Richard Arenberg, visiting professor of the practice of political science and a senior fellow at the Watson Institute. I'm honored to serve this year as interim director of the Taubman Center, which is a part of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome to the many Brown students, faculty, and alumni, and other interested citizens joining us virtually. The Taubman Center seeks to influence American politics and policy through scholarship, public opinion polling, conferences, workshops, academic research, internships, and a robust series of speakers drawn from experts, the media, academia, think tanks, and public officials. The Taubman Center for several years has focused its efforts on three themes: the pursuit of security, the cost of living, and the challenges to our democracy in America. This year, we're placing special emphasis on the national elections and the subsequent consequences as the nation grapples with issues of social justice, public health, education, the economy, and commitment to the rule of law. Tonight, we present the fifth in our series of events. We're honored to have as our guest one of the United States Senate's most respected voices, Rhode Island's own Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse served in the U.S. Senate, has served in the U.S. Senate since 2013. He previously served as a United States Attorney from 1993 to 1998, and as Attorney General of Rhode Island from 1999 to 2003. Senator Whitehouse graduated from Yale University and the University of Virginia School of Law. He's a member of the Judiciary Committee, the Committee on Environment and Public Works, the Budget Committee, and the prestigious Senate Finance Committee. Senator Whitehouse is recognized within the Senate as an advocate for his progressive principles, but as one of the few members still willing to work across the aisle in a bipartisan way to address the nation's most pressing problems. Senator Whitehouse has been at the center of bipartisan efforts to pass laws overhauling federal education policy, rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, reforming the criminal and juvenile justice systems, protecting Americans from toxic chemicals in everyday products, and addressing ocean plastic waste, to name just a few, quite a few. He's been a strong defender of Social Security and Medicare, and has made improving care and reducing costs in our healthcare system a hallmark of his career. To counteract the corrosive effects of special interests in our democracy, Senator Whitehouse has worked to root out dark money from our elections and make Congress and the courts accountable to the American people. As the Providence Journal has put it, quote, while fighting in Washington against corporate interests and their influence on the political process, Senator Whitehouse has not forgotten the people back home. My conversation with Senator Whitehouse will last approximately until 7:30 and will be followed by questions and answers with the audience for about 30 minutes. You may enter questions through the Q&A function, which will be viewable to me. You may begin entering questions if you have them, beginning now and throughout the program. Please keep them short and to the point. I'll convey as many of these questions to the Senator as we have time for. This event is being recorded for later viewing, available on the Taubman Center website or the Watson Institute website. Now it's my great honor to introduce to you the Senator from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thank you, Rich. It is wonderful to be with you. And before we get into the business of the evening, let me just say a big thank you to the Taubman Center and the Watson Institute and Brown University. You are such important parts of our Rhode Island community. And Rich, a big thank you to you for doing this. And for those of you who are listening or watching, Rich worked for Carl Levin, who was in the Senate when I got there. He was kind of a mentor of mine. He was probably both the best lawyer and the smartest person in the Senate while he was there. And we worked together on attacking the Bush administration torture program in particular. And that's where I saw his skills at great work.
Terrific guy.
Yeah, really special guy.
Well, Senator, I thought before we dive into politics and policy, I wanted to ask you about the legacy of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was clearly one of the most important and influential justices in the Supreme Court's entire history. What among her many accomplishments stands out for you?
For me, what stands out is her persistence. She had a very tough experience at Harvard Law School as one of very few women, maybe 6 or 7 in a class of hundreds. But she hung in there and she really distinguished herself. Her husband got terribly ill at the time, so she had to not only do her coursework, but take his notes and keep him up to speed. And then she transferred to Columbia and ended up getting her degree from there, but couldn't get a job. Nobody would hire her. So she struggled through all of that and ended up teaching and doing work for charitable organizations and for the women's rights movement. And that's where she really began to shine, because she developed a persistent, careful litigation strategy that case by case, day by day, developed the case law that we now enjoy across this country with full equality for women. And then, of course, Bill Clinton put her on the Supreme Court. She had a real interesting transformation there. She went from being a friendly, kind of bipartisan, very thoughtful, very smart, very principled judge to somebody who became iconic for their dissents. As she watched the court shift rightwards and lean more towards corporate capture, her dissents became livelier and livelier. And now across the country, there are women and young girls who see her as a complete role model. And she was one. And she just never gave up, never gave up, never gave up, never gave up until the end. And while many things are won with great battles that suddenly shift everything at once, some things are won with small, determined, continued demonstrations of persistence. And she produced that. And as a result, I think she's one of the most significant figures in American history. And the fact that she's the first woman and the first person of the Jewish faith to lie in state in Congress, in the Capitol, I think is completely appropriate for her.
That was a wonderful honor, but in some ways it's sad that the national tributes for her have been more abbreviated than they might otherwise be because of the rush to fill her seat on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's a dishonor to her in many respects, but it's also a signal of something to look out for.
Senator, you've been one of the driving forces behind a series of reports from the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee entitled Captured Courts.
Yeah.
Among other things, the reports focus on the huge level of funding from special interests pushing for conservative judges, pointing to at least $250 million in so-called dark money. How has that money translated into presidential selection of judges and confirming them in the Senate?
Well, it's kind of taken it over. The conduit for that takeover has been the Federalist Society, So let me say a quick word about the Federalist Society, which is an organization that has, campus groups all across law schools, all across the country, which is totally fine. I've got no objection to that whatsoever. They also are sort of a think tank in Washington, and think tanks in Washington aren't the greatest thing in the world, but it's no different than many. And so I don't have a particular complaint about that either. But through the Federalist Society, a very small group of very big donors has achieved control over the selection process for justices and judges, many judges, particularly circuit court judges. And that problem is one that has been overlooked until pretty recently. The problem continues because once they've selected the judge, then they put on campaigns with TV advertisements and everything, just like a political campaign, for the confirmation of the judge. And like the Federalist Society operation, this operation run by Judicial Crisis Network is also funded by anonymous donors. So this same set of anonymous donors is behind selecting who gets put onto the court and campaigning for their confirmation. And that gives them an enormous amount of power and probably a veto or a strong voice in who gets selected. And it's just wrong to have a private group with anonymous donors with such a prominent role in the makeup of our Supreme Court. The pathway to corruption is a very short one from that set of circumstances.
Yeah, and they've by any measure, they've been wildly successful at this.
Unbelievably, in fact.
Trump has put 53 of the powerful circuit court judges on the court, more conservative, more white, younger, just about every measure you can use. I mean, the importance of younger judges, as you know, is that since they serve for life, young judges are likely to be on the court for many decades.
Yeah.
But my question is, they've been at this for a couple of decades now, sort of laser focused on getting this done.
Yep.
Why is it that the Republicans are able to do that and the return fire from Democrats has been so inadequate?
Well, we've been slow to respond, and there's no doubt about it. But let's not give too much credit to the Republicans, because in this effort, they are more or less a functionary. This effort isn't driven by the Republican Party. It's driven by big interests behind the Republican Party who tell the Republican Party what to do. And we have been slow to catch up with it, but we're on the case now. And I intend to continue working very hard to expose this operation because it's just wrong. I've done a fair amount of appellate argument. I've argued a case in the Supreme Court. I've argued multiple cases in circuit courts of appeal. I've argued more times than I can remember in our state Supreme Court. And to go into court with the feeling that the court is rigged against you, not because of the law, but because of the client, because of who you're representing, I think has to be a terrible, terrible feeling. And I'm sure the lawyers representing the labor movement in the Janus case had that feeling because they had seen that case develop through previous cases and they knew the fix was in.
I don't want to drag you into a discussion of the filibuster at this point, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, in 2013, as you well know, it was the Democrats that eliminated the filibuster, or rather reinterpreted it, in order to allow us a simple majority to end debate and confirm judges to the court. And that's
the circuit courts.
The circuit courts, right? The lower courts, district. Yeah. But of course, that precedent, as could have easily been foreseen was immediately rolled out by Mitch McConnell and the Republicans at first opportunity and extended to the Supreme Court. I guess my question is there any regret in the Democratic caucus, any kind of feeling that that maybe this went too far?
Not from me. There is no doubt in my mind, given the power of the influences that are behind the court packing program that the Republican Party is operating, that Mitch was going to do whatever it took to pound nominees through to the Supreme Court. Look what he did to Merrick Garland.
Sure.
Look what he did to the conventions of the Senate around the so-called blue slip, around local control over circuit court seats. Look what he did to basic rules of what needs to be provided to the Judiciary Committee in a nominations hearing. I mean, they will let nothing stand in their way when it comes to putting judges on the Supreme Court who've been selected by this big donor operation. And it's largely because that same big donor operation is also their big donor operation. Mm-hmm. Once we have, I think, a good view into who's behind the dark money that supports the court packing operation, we will also find, I believe, that that is also what funds the dark money campaign funding that Mitch McConnell utilizes to protect his majority. So you tie those things together and it becomes obvious why they behave this way. But the notion that Mitch McConnell was not going to break the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees is fanciful.
Okay. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, you'll play a prominent role in the hearings on Amy Coney Barrett, on her nomination. Given McConnell's strong hand, do you think there's any chance of it being delayed beyond Election Day? You know, perhaps not wishing illness on anyone, but if additional GOP senators become ill, is there a possibility that the decision could be delayed until after Election Day? And then if it is, if Biden has won the election and Democrats are about to take over the control of the Senate, do you think that will weaken the resolve of the Republican caucus, you know, to go that far to confirm Supreme Court justice during a lame duck session, where the confirmation would be by a number of senators who have just been defeated at the polls?
I think they will do whatever it takes. And if they have to cram a nominee through after an election that they have lost, I believe that they will do that. I think that this is an enormous priority for them, probably the highest priority of the little donor elite that has captured the Republican Party on this.
Do you have strong feelings about the nominee herself?
I don't know the nominee. She came through our committee towards her circuit court position. I voted against her then. She seems to be a very extreme doctrinaire conservative, and I fear for the Affordable Care Act, and I fear for Roe versus Wade with her on the court. The Republican appointed justices of the Supreme Court, by my count, have run up 80 decisions that are all characterized by being partisan decisions with a very narrow, bare 5-4 majority, and where the big donor interests have a very identifiable victory. Mm-hmm. So, and it's 80-0. So it's really, you know, they've run the table. they got stopped on a few things. They're very cautious about messing around with Roe v. Wade at the Supreme Court, and Roberts switched to vote with the Democratic appointees on the Affordable Care Act. So and also Obergefell, the gay marriage case, went just 5-4. So you really tip the balance of the court when this new nominee joins. And it could very well be that Roe versus Wade, the Affordable Care Act, and gay rights all suffer dramatically as a result. And indeed, it is actually in the platform of the Republican Party to attack those three decisions and to reverse them with their appointees. So take them at their word. This is what they say they're going to do. Why would we not believe them?
Some of your colleagues in the Democratic caucus have suggested that if the Republicans go ahead and ram this nomination through before the election, that if Joe Biden wins the presidency and Democrats have the majority in the Senate, that they project, or they suggest increasing the size of the Supreme Court. Is that something you've thought about, or you just think it's premature to think about it? Or
no, we have a lot of measures that we could take regarding the Supreme Court. I've already announced my desire to get a number of laws passed that relate to Supreme Court transparency, so that when these phony groups show up as amici curiae, friends of the court, they've got to disclose who their funders are. And when you run ads for a Supreme Court nominee, you've got to disclose who your donors are, and ditto with the Federalist Society and its efforts to control the selection of justices. If you're going to get involved in that game, we should know who your donors are so we can protect the integrity of the court. So there's a fairly obvious, baseline. As we look at other things, I think the point that we need to pay attention to is the point that lawyers know when they're arguing before a judge or before a jury. If you want to ask for an extraordinary remedy, you don't get to just ask for it, and raising your voice doesn't help. You've got to prove your case. And I think it's going to be very important for us in a new Congress, if we have the gavels to do it in the Senate, to work with the House to make the case to the American public about what has happened to the Supreme Court. Because if they come along with us and follow the facts with us, I think they will be satisfied and perhaps even eager for us to make some significant changes to clean up and reform the Supreme Court. If we just jump to the remedy without having made that case, without having explained to the American people why we do this, what the situation is, then all we've done is A, spooked them, and B, played into the Republicans' political hands. So I think it's really, really important that we do our homework before we ultimately settle on our reform portfolio.
It's also been suggested that the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico be granted statehood. You see that in the same light, or is...
Yeah, I see that in the same light. And in both cases, there's an interesting phenomenon at play, which is that the Republicans have completely lost their credibility. They forfeited any standing to object on either. All the mischief that they've done to stuff through the last three nominees, the jamming of Merrick Garland to leave room for Gorsuch, the cramming through of Kavanaugh with an investigation that was at least truncated and perhaps even fake, and now this complete 180 reversal to ram the new nominee through in the, forget eve of an election, as voting is going on in election, completely discredits them. With respect to the DC and Puerto Rico issue, the Republicans have been very happy to govern from the minority. They've had two presidents who lost the majority vote. They've had Congresses in which they controlled Congress, but because of gerrymandering, they controlled Congress against the majority vote of the American people. And the Senate over and over, constantly, is controlled by a minority of Americans because of the small state, big state problem of New York and California and so forth being counted the same as North and South Dakota. So there have been times when the Republican president, a Republican-controlled Congress, and a Republican-controlled Senate were all in charge, but none of them had enjoyed the support of the majority of Americans. And if we had made that point more energetically, I think we'd be in a stronger position now. But again, you know, if you want to serve democracy well, you've got to win your case first with the American people and then implement your change.
Okay. The president yesterday pulled the plug on the stimulus bill.
Yep.
And is that the end of any hope that this could get done before the election?
Likely. He's such a unpredictable person, and his White House is such a chaotic operation that it's hard to tell. They could do a 180 and be the exact opposite later. In fact, he was tweeting out about the need for a big bill in the same week that he said he wasn't going to negotiate about one. So it's very hard to sort through this mess with them. But back to the Supreme Court, you know, I think this is something that we've got to continue to emphasize to the American people as we close on the November election. The support across the country for getting some more COVID relief out there is abundant. It runs through corporate America. It runs through voters from right to left. It is, in some cases, virtually desperate in some industries like the hospitality industry and the airline industry. And the fact that Mitch McConnell won't move a COVID bill, won't negotiate with Nancy Pelosi in the House, and has said that there's no urgency there when Americans feel enormous urgency, but then he flips the script and goes high speed, hair on fire, mad rush to fill a Supreme Court seat when the vast majority of Americans don't want that filled. Just as the Republicans said in Garland Gorsuch, they want to have their voice considered in the election with respect to the filling of that seat by a big, big majority. So they're running against the wishes of the American people in both of these things, and the contrast is apparent. So I think they've made a terrible political mistake, and because of the way I think America's headed, I'm glad they made that political mistake.
Yeah, it seems that in an odd sort of way that the Republicans also have been unable to get themselves on the same sheet of paper.
Yeah, that's been their problem. Their problem hasn't been that they're unwilling to negotiate with Democrats. Their problem has been that they've been incapable of coming to a negotiating position among themselves.
Yes.
And you can't very well negotiate with another party who can't form a negotiating position and who's having a huge internal fight. So right. We've been very, very frustrated. Nancy Pelosi passed her bill, back in May?
Right.
May, June, July, August, September, now October, no action, no negotiations, because the White House, the Republicans in the House of Representatives, and Mitch McConnell can't sort themselves out.
So looking at the 2020 election as it applies to the Senate, there's a whole array of tight Senate races.
Yep.
Many more than even...
More being added every day.
Many more than even the most optimistic forecasters, Democratic forecasters, would have foreseen.
Yeah.
So the recent polls look very good. How confident do you feel about a Democratic majority?
Not at all. I still have PTSD from 2016.
Yes.
And I've watched the last minute dark money tsunamis flood into elections before. So I'm very much in the put the pedal to the metal and fight every minute all the way through. I don't think there's any room for relaxation or confidence until we actually see the vote counted.
It's odd for me to say this just after you gave the good advice you just gave, but for the moment, for the sake of argument, let's assume there is a Democratic majority.
Yep.
In January.
Knock wood.
Yes. What are the things that? What are the principal 2 or 3 things that you feel should be at the top of the agenda?
So I think the first thing to do is to pass the equivalent of H.R. 1. There was a reason that Speaker Pelosi put together H.R. 1, the democracy reform bill in the House. There is a reason the Democratic members in the House branded that as the first bill they wanted to lead with, because we have to push back against the corruption and influence that has corroded our democracy. We have to push back against the dark money that's created this tsunami of slime in our politics. And that, I think, is critical. And it's fairly ready to go. Most of the pieces of the House's H.R. 1 and the Senate's We the People bill have been worked over pretty well. So I think we could pass that fairly quickly. The next order of business to get to, still in the spring, still early on, is a major climate change bill. We don't know how bad things are with respect to the climate. We don't know how many tipping points might be reached that are irreversible. Time is not on our side. So we have to push really, really hard to pass a major, major climate bill. And then the third piece I would go to would be to undo the, I think, very wrong Republican tax relief bill that gave almost all of its benefit to big corporations and to the wealthiest Americans, and also pull the tax tricks that they stuffed into the COVID bill, believe it or not. They put more money for millionaires and billionaires in tax breaks into the COVID bill than they put in for hospitals. And we got a little bit fooled by them because we didn't know until after the vote was taken exactly how big the money was. But I've been all over that issue. So those would be my first 3: a major tax reform, major climate bill, and lead with the big democracy reform.
Just a personal note on the climate change. Just recently, I was looking at a video clip that I have, and was sharing it with someone else from the very first hearing on climate change. We called it the greenhouse back then.
Led by Senator John Chafee.
Well, there's an even
Rhode Island.
There's an even earlier one, and that was Paul Tsongas, for whom I was working at the time, and he held a hearing on the greenhouse effect and talked about sea rise and the possibility that Boston, big portions of Boston, would be underwater and so forth. The only reason I bring it up is it's shocking to realize that that was 40 years ago.
Yep. And the first Senate hearing in the Environment and Public Works Committee was led by John Chafee of Rhode Island, and it produced a bipartisan letter, I want to say by 8 senators, to the Congressional Science Group saying, report to us on what we should do to solve this problem. Yeah. It was bipartisan. Frankly, it was bipartisan all the way through until Citizens United was decided, and that gave the fossil fuel industry the massive weaponry to knock any idea about doing something on climate out of the head of the Republican Party. And they just crushed any dissent in the Republican Party, and they turned it into basically the political wing of the fossil fuel industry. But I lived that too. When I was serving with Carl in the early days, it was 07, 08, and 09, and there were 4 or 5 bipartisan climate bills kicking around the Senate. John McCain ran as a Republican, as the nominee for the presidency with a good climate platform. It all came to a crashing halt with Citizens United, which gave to the fossil fuel industry this appalling political weaponry.
So one of the things that, one of the many things that the president has worked hard to do is to undermine voter confidence in mail-in balloting.
Yep.
And, he's called the elections themselves rigged, and he suggested that the only way he could lose the election if it is rigged and it is stolen from him. How concerned are you about the about whether the election will be destabilized in some way, and or that a Biden victory won't lead to a peaceful transfer of power?
Very. There are 3 possible outcomes. One is a clear and convincing Trump victory. The second is a clear and convincing Biden victory. And the third, and depending on whether this wave we're starting to see crests more, the third is a closely contested election. And in a closely contested election, what Trump has done is to create the rhetorical space to attack the results, the legal apparatus to challenge the results, and now in this mad rush to get the new nominee onto the court, potentially a 6-3 court to throw the election to him in a Bush v. Gore 2.0.
Yeah, and it's remarkable that even beyond that, he's been unwilling to commit himself to the peaceful transfer of power. I mean, you could do all of those things. You could make all of those challenges, and argue that you were playing it out in a normal legal fashion.
Yeah.
But one thing that's been sacrosanct in this country from the very beginning, I mean, it's one of the great precedents that George Washington laid down, and that was the peaceful exchange of power.
Yep. Yep. I think we may see Joe Biden sworn in, invited to Congress to take his oath by the Speaker and by the Majority Leader, but primarily by the Speaker. And Trump still fuming in the White House. And at that point, I think it's important that the institutions of the United States, the Secret Service and others, do their duty and clear out the White House for the newly sworn president. And if that means marching Trump out of the White House, then that means marching Trump out of the White House.
Wow.
That's not a look I think he wants. I suspect he'd get out before that actually happened.
So if I understand what you're saying, in many ways, we're left relying on a landslide.
Well, certainly that makes things clear. It doesn't have to be a full-on landslide, just so long as the results are not legitimately disputable by anyone. And at the moment, again, I'm very cautious about saying this because I'm so anxious after 2016. But at the moment, the trend is towards exactly that happening. And if that does happen, that will be a blessing on this country because it will undo the prospect of all of this Trump election mischief that he is threatening. It just becomes background noise rather than an actual event in our history.
I know asking you to predict what's going to happen in the Republican Party is, asking you to look from the outside in. But I'm wondering if you, assuming that kind of election where Trump is clearly defeated, Biden becomes the president, are we left with still left with a Trumpist Republican Party or something entirely different?
I think that there's a significant fracture in the Republican Party. I think that the never-Trumpers are vindicated. I think that the corporate support for the Republican Party is already shifting and will try to settle on a more sensible party. I think you'll find a bunch of dead-enders from militia groups and racist organizations and white supremacists and so forth who are just never going to forget that Trump gave them credit and brought them up out of America's basement into the regular rooms. So I think we'll have them to deal with for a long while. And I think that a Biden presidency, if it's done well, can reach out to the rural and urban Americans who felt so left out that they felt Trump was their salvation, and try to rebuild confidence in democracy by giving them what they want and working with them and letting them know they've been listened to. So I think it's at the end of the day, the Republican Party is going to look very different if Trump crashes. I know from friends in the Senate who I would be improper for me to name names here, but there are people who go along with Trump because they're afraid of his tweets. They're afraid of the far, far extremist right whom he has enabled, but they find him disreputable. They find him disgraceful. And if they could push a button and be rid of him without anybody knowing that they did it, they'd probably push that button.
Yes. The New York Times, based on the president's tax returns going back about 2 decades, alleged that he paid no income tax in 11 of those years, and that in 2017 he paid only $750, the now famous $750. Putting aside whether or not crimes were committed, what does this say about the fairness of the federal tax system if billionaires can use loopholes to pay no taxes?
Well, that's why, for me, cleaning up the tax system came in number 3 behind cleaning up democracy and cleaning up our atmosphere and oceans with a big climate bill. It's that important because not only on the merits of the unfair distribution of the burden of taxation, but also on the message that it sends. The message to ordinary Americans that they pay a higher tax rate than a billionaire hedge fund manager. There are people who work in New York apartment buildings, in the most expensive buildings in the city, who pay a higher tax rate on their income than the billionaire owner of the apartment that they clean, or that they hold the umbrella out in front of for the billionaire getting out of his limo. And that's no way to run a country. It just is totally wrong for the person sitting in his private jet, watching his leather suitcase being loaded in the rain by somebody out on the tarmac into his plane, for that person to be paying a lower tax rate than the guy out on the tarmac in the rain. And we've got to fix that. And it's corrosive to our society as well as just bad economic and tax policy.
But those same story from the New York Times indicated that President Trump owes something on the order of $400 million to creditors, unidentified creditors,
Yeah,
that
potentially foreign creditors.
he's personally responsible for, and apparently not too far in the distant future. Do you see this as a national security concern?
Not only do I see it as a national security concern, national security people see this as a national security concern. When you're having a background investigation done to apply for a job at the National Security Council or at the CIA or even in the US military, one of the questions they ask you is, how much money do you owe? Because a big debt is a lever that can be used to try to corrupt you or intimidate you into doing something that is against the interests of your country. And it's probably disqualifying for almost everybody, even if you knocked off 3 zeros. But the idea that this guy owes $500 million to unknown folks creates an obvious conflict of interest and an obvious motive to indulge in very, very bad behavior. And you consider his existing record of bad behavior, the notion that he's too honorable to do that is obviously laughable.
Let me give you the kind of an open-ended opportunity to describe your reaction to the manner in which the national response to this pandemic has been conducted.
Haphazard, chaotic, dishonest, partisan, sloppy, ineffective. We deserved better. And sadly, there were plenty of people in the United States government willing and able to provide better if they had just been listened to. But there is this corrosive problem that has run through the Republican Party of science denial and politicizing of science. And the problem is that science is often measuring things that are happening in real life, that are happening in nature, that are happening because of the laws of physics and biology. And you may be able to talk your way around them for a while in politics, but the laws of physics will prevail.
Yes.
And the laws of biology will prevail. The laws of epidemiology will prevail. And to ignore them is to put people and institutions at terrible risk. And that's exactly what he did. It's really embarrassing to be lined up with India and Brazil and other barely developed countries as the worst performers in all of this, while the people we usually hold ourselves up against, Germany, Great Britain, Japan, France, the Norwegian country, Sweden, it's embarrassing, and it's tragic for the 200,000 families who lost a loved one.
Indeed. Who would have ever expected that an issue like whether or not to wear a surgical mask would become a politically polarized debate?
Yeah, it makes no practical sense. But obviously for Trump, it made political sense, and he wielded that weapon. Now, I think that part of what he has done, the political chickens are coming home to roost. And I think all across America, people are very fed up with this. I mean, I think moms across America who generally have a leadership role in their homes, who have perhaps, a job and their home responsibilities, and now they've got their kids at home because they can't get them safely to school, or they've got the extra worry that they're in school, but they're really nervous about it and they have to do all the extra care of trying to take care of their kids. And there may be somebody in the family who's been sick. They may have lost someone. I mean, you start to pile up the anxieties, and that makes people very upset. And a lot of the chaos in American homes is directly attributable to the chaos that Trump has caused in the White House and in our government.
We've just come off of the it was easily the most chaotic and disheartening presidential debate that's been held in all of the time that we've had presidential debates. Do you see this as a one-time kind of bad behavior event, or is there some sort of structural response to the way in which the commission sets up these debates that's necessary?
I think it would be very hard to have done much to control President Trump, given the way he behaved himself. And if they had tried to control him further, he would have just flipped the narrative to the fake news media trying to, hold me down when I'm trying to fight for you. So it was kind of a no-win proposition, except for the fact that the American people took a look at this and I think were revulsed. I think you saw a dramatic slide in the president's approval, and it was widely viewed that Biden won the debate, and the more it had a chance to settle in, the stronger that feeling got. So I hope it's a one-off. If Trump wins the election, then I think we can expect a lot more of that, and maybe it becomes the standard way for American politics. But I think if he loses, it's pretty clear that Americans want to go back to a normal, orderly, empathetic, caring, sensible, and fair mode of governance.
Speaking of debates, of course, the vice presidential debate is this evening. Do you think it's there's more attention being paid to it, and it has more significance because the nation's been, just been reminded about how a vice president serves a heartbeat away from the presidency?
Yeah, I couldn't say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. As a member of the Budget Committee, do you think Congress will ever get back to what we call the regular order? That is, agree on a budget resolution and pass on time the appropriations bills necessary to fund the government?
I hope so. At the moment, the Budget Committee is nothing but a vehicle for budget reconciliation and a certain amount of pontification on the way. It's way too tedious to get into on this program, but I have developed a new way for the Budget Committee to work that would remedy a lot of the defects in the current process that make it a useless process. And I think if we do that, we could potentially get onto a sensible structure for dealing with the budget and addressing the problems that we face. But at the moment, the way in which the Budget Committee is set up virtually prevents that from happening. The reform, I hope, will correct that, and I hope we can make progress on that reform.
Good. Before we turn to audience questions, I want to give you the opportunity. In virtually every election for decades, the age cohort that's had the lowest turnout are the youngest voters.
Yep.
We've got an audience here tonight, a large audience, many of whom are in that cohort.
Yep.
And I wanted to give you the opportunity to encourage participation.
I would say that the people who are running the United States government right now are busily robbing your future. And they're doing so for the worst of all possible reasons. And in part, they're doing it because they don't think you'll come out and vote. They think they can get away with it. So please correct them. Please show up and vote and make a difference. Because if young voters do in fact show up, it changes outcomes. It changes outcomes.
Okay, let's turn to some questions from the audience.
So while you're teeing up questions, let me go back to one thing that I said, because I'd like to just elaborate on it a little bit. This problem of science denial, there's always been a kind of a wacky strain of it in the Republican Party. There's been, people who think that vaccinations aren't right. There have been people who think that evolution isn't right. There have been people who think that the Earth only started 6,000 years ago. There have been, people in the basement with tinfoil around their heads. But it was always a fringe group. Now, science denial has become Republican Party policy in many areas. And where it went from the fringe to being Republican Party policy is, I think, through very deliberate corporate care and feeding and growth of that anti-science sentiment. First by the tobacco industry, which wanted to fight back all the science about the death and illness that their product was causing. And then when we beat them largely through attorneys general and lawsuits, and that apparatus collapsed, it didn't actually really collapse. It moved over and became the base of the climate denial apparatus, where again, the attack on virtually uncontested science had enormous ramifications for a very powerful industry. So, there's a backstory to this that is part of the degradation of democracy. These industries fomented science denial in order to protect their very dangerous products and byproducts.
Yeah, in the course of making that point, you mentioned vaccination denial. I'm wondering if you're concerned about whether a strain of that will be, when and if we do get an effective vaccine for the coronavirus, whether you're concerned that response will undermine the effectiveness of vaccinating the public.
It could, but I suspect that given the experience we've had with this virus, if a vaccine proves itself safe and effective, I think people will flock to it. We're more likely to have the problem of trying to make sure that it gets first to where it needs to get to the nurses and the teachers and the first responders and police officers and the people who are out there protecting us day in and day out, and then to people who are more exposed and more at risk, and then finally, much later on to healthy people for whom it's not as urgent a matter.
Okay, let's turn to questions from the audience. What would it take to change the rule of lifetime appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court? Why not 10 years?
As I understand it, we could change the rules for future Supreme Court and judicial appointees. And there's been talk about an 18-year term, for instance, or staggering terms so that, in each presidency, a certain number rolled over. So you didn't have big political surges and the court shaped based on what party happened to control the presidency and what period. The problem is for the sitting ones, the Constitution protects them during their tenure in office as part of protecting judicial independence. So if they got sworn into a lifetime seat, they get a lifetime seat.
Changing the subject a bit, but what can we expect from tonight's vice presidential debate, in your opinion, and what are things we should pay close attention to?
I really don't know. I think that Kamala Harris presents extremely well, and I think she'll be going in trying to make sure she doesn't make any mistakes, because the whole campaign is in a good place right now. So you probably won't see her at her boldest, but I think you will see a very, very able communicator and presenter. And I think she will do very, very well. I think the vice president comes in bearing the burden of Trump's recent behavior, particularly his debate behavior, and it's his job to try to clean up after Trump and to try to show that not everybody in the Oval Office is chaotically undisciplined, and that this is a White House that you can trust with significant public responsibilities in the years ahead, which are two things that Trump really didn't show very well in his debate. So he's got, I think, a significant repair job. I would particularly like to see some of the issues that I said we would go to come up. I thought the climate issue was dealt with very weakly in the first debate. Believe it or not, it's the first time that any debate moderator in a presidential debate has asked a question about climate change. I mean, the press has been so AWOL on this issue. It's really been infuriating. So I hope that we see more of that. And I think quite recently, Pence called climate change a myth. So, you know, he's clearly out in the climate denial fringe with the Koch brothers apparatus and the rest of all of that. So I think, you know, Senator Harris has some great opportunities on that. I think the cleaning up of America, the dark money, is a great issue that we almost never raise, that has big popular resonance. And then Trump's tax returns and his $750 payment just sits there waiting to be addressed.
Addressing those issues that you've underlined so far tonight, this member of the audience asks, what can individual citizens do to help you in these efforts?
I'm going to say one very specific thing, and it relates to climate change. But I've got to tee it up by describing the predicament we have, which is that if you take corporate America and you carve out the fossil fuel industry, you have a fossil fuel industry that, despite what its CEOs might say, is still funding and propagating climate denial and obstruction full force. They've got a whole apparatus of front groups. They're still at it. They're still doing it. And so you shouldn't think, because you hear some occasional nice comments from some big oil CEO, that they've stopped the most aggressive and successful campaign of political obstruction that Congress has ever seen. On the other side, far bigger, far more powerful than just the fossil fuel industry is all the rest of corporate America. Big ag, big tech, Wall Street, the finance sector, consumer goods, all of that. Those companies do not lift a finger in Congress on climate change. Even the ones with the best sustainability policies, even ones with the most stirring websites, when they come to Congress, they abandon climate change. They couldn't care less in Congress. So what my Republican colleagues see is a corporate sector that they're primarily interested in which the fossil fuel industry is still full on attacking climate change, attacking climate action. The big trade associations like the US Chamber of Commerce are terrible oppositional forces against us. And the rest of corporate America, the other companies themselves, many of whom stand behind the US Chamber of Commerce, are doing nothing. They're putting up with obstruction. So the more that individuals can communicate to companies that they deal with, whether it's Coca-Cola and Pepsi, whether it's their bank, any company whose products you buy, please send the CEO a letter. There are actually a lot of young people working on this right now in an active group to try to push for corporate climate leadership. And we are actually working with that group to help propagate their message, but it's students all across the country. And I will tell you that particularly consumer goods companies very much want the young market. And they want people to lock in liking them and liking their products. So your pressure on these companies will be big. I'll go back to Coke and Pepsi because they're an easy example. They have good sustainability policies. They got great websites. They say all the right things. They have a trade association called the American Beverage Association that you can track its spending. Doesn't do a damn thing about climate. When we tried to get them to participate with Obamacare because of the healthcare costs of the sugary drinks they sell, boom, their spending and their lobbying spiked through the roof. But on climate, they do essentially zero, and they support the US Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the worst climate obstructors in America, according to Influence Map. That's not just me saying that. So get after the companies that you like, whether it's Apple or Google or Microsoft or Facebook, you name it. They are sleeping at the wheel in Congress on climate. And if they can be awakened to take an interest, then that will begin to change things. Because right now they're letting the fossil fuel industry run the show.
Okay, this is from a colleague of mine, Professor Rose McDermott, who says, thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. Two quick questions. One, I share the concern about the election. Do you worry about violence in the wake of the election, and how might that be handled?
Yeah, I think there might be some. I would hope and expect that there won't be too much. The biggest danger that I see is Trump calling out essentially citizen militias to go and behave threateningly at polling places. And on our side, we are developing a very, very robust legal response program, a little bit like having a fire department that will be able to go to any polling place anywhere in any of the contested states. We need to have like a legal fire department that when the militia shows up with their flags and their, trucks and their firearms and start intimidating people who are waiting in line at the polls, we can get an injunction putting an end to that instantly before it turns into a confrontation. We don't want to have the confrontations of Charlottesville reenacted at polling places in this country, and having lawyers ready to go to get them to knock that off, I think will help calm that down. People always vote peacefully unless they're provoked by outside antagonists. And Trump calling up outside antagonists has created this risk.
Her second question is, what are the prospects for rolling back the horrible environmental deregulation that Trump has implemented should Biden be elected?
Well, we have to make it a priority. I think pretty good. Actually, a lot of the stuff that they've tried to do, they have failed at because they've been sloppy about the administrative procedure. And they've had to cut such corners to try to get where they want to go that courts won't let them do it. So like mining leases in public lands that totally ignored climate change, totally ignored the price of carbon, totally ignored what's called the social cost of carbon, have been thrown out. They blew up their effort to try to undo the fuel efficiency standards. And so in some respects, it's not as bad as it seems, but we have to get after it as a very, very strong priority. And, it's not enough just to do the big climate bill. We have to do that as a priority, but we also have to make sure that we're going through those agencies and getting out the people who are against the mission of the agency, who are indebted to the polluting industries, who are there to disserve the American public rather than serve the American public, and to, as rapidly as possible, undo the administrative procedures, reverse the executive orders, withdraw the judicial pleadings, just do that right away. I would love to see Biden, on the day after he signs his articles of investiture as president, sign the mother of all executive orders that does a lot of this cleanup all at once on day one across multiple agencies of government. So he's not trapped like Gulliver under 1,000 Lilliputian threads of internal conflict and resistance from dead enders who haven't been gotten out of their positions, former Trumpsters.
What does the Democratic Party need to do in the near future to attract people who voted for Trump and or didn't vote in the last election?
I think there's a message of economic fairness that has traditionally been associated with the Democratic Party, and that is very ripe right now because so many people are suffering economically. Real wages have not climbed, although the economy has climbed. The wealth gap between our richest and our poorest has not been this bad since before Teddy Roosevelt cleaned things up a century ago, more than a century ago. And we, for a long time, really overlooked rural America. And I think that if we, the election is now weeks away, so we're not going to fix big problems like that between now and then. But I do think that the next Democratic administration should really, really, really work hard on rural outreach and on very visibly listening to workers and making sure that people know that we have their backs and are willing to undo some of the mischief that's been done on behalf of the super wealthy.
A related question, in what ways could the Democratic Party improve its standing in the American South and the Midwest?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think demographics is helping already. We have Senate seats in play in Georgia, North Carolina, and even South Carolina. It was an unusual circumstance because of the bizarre nature of the Republican candidate, but we have a Democratic senator from Alabama. So I think that there is really ground to be gained there, both by giving the African-American vote a real motivation to participate, and by playing into the suburbs of the major cities more effectively, where I think women are really fed up with Trump and his extremes and are looking for an alternative. And I think a little bit of peace and quiet, a little bit of, no crazy tweeting, a little bit of dignity and decorum will let a lot of Americans just be able to breathe a sigh of relief at last. Just stop it already. And I think that's an avenue into a lot of American hearts, north, south, east, and west.
Again, another related question. The U.S. demographic will change in 2022 and 2024, young, progressive, diverse, etc. Can the Democratic Party change enough to make the policy changes that might be possible?
Yeah, I think if we can't, then shame on us, because what the change is that the question is calling for is really a return to our roots as the party of working Americans trying to fight back against massive assemblies of capital and wealth and their corrupting power in Congress. That was sort of what we were all about for a long time. So All we have to do is rediscover that and, get the work done too. People want to see us fight for them. They want to see us do big things. It's not enough just to be talking the talk. We've got to be willing to have the fights, do the work, and make the change. And I think if we do that, then support will follow.
Another dangerous hurricane is bearing down on the Gulf Coast, likely to destroy homes and also upend refineries and petrochemical facilities, dumping yet more toxic chemicals into the air and water. We're fueling the conditions that are also threatening our supply of energy and materials. What possibility exists for a federally led plan/transition from this suicidal direction? Can you imagine a national energy policy that changes course?
Yes. Not only can I imagine it, I will be working enormously hard to make sure that that is an early piece of major legislation. You can't fix the climate problem without correcting our energy policy, and we're on a virtually suicidal course right now. And it's not as if the warnings aren't clear and many. We're seeing warnings out of Freddie Mac, for Pete's sake, the mortgage company, about a coastal property values crash because of sea level rise and storms that will be worse than the 2008 mortgage meltdown. We're seeing monsters of the finance industry like BlackRock warn that there's going to be upheaval in the entire finance industry if we don't get ahead of climate change. And we're seeing virtually every central bank of every developed country warn about a carbon bubble bursting that takes down not just the fossil fuel industry, but the world economy. And these are warnings coming from everywhere and constantly, including very recently from Trump's own Commodity Futures Trading Commission and from 3 of our Federal Reserve banks. So we have been well and truly warned, and there's nothing but the mischief of the fossil fuel industry in Congress that is holding us back from getting this done.
One person asks, do you support the Green New Deal?
I sure support the goals and the ideas of the Green New Deal. And we're going to get it done. It may have to be in sequence. The New Deal happened across multiple bills. The Green New Deal is something that we have to be careful about as a badged entity, because the person who called for a vote on the Green New Deal was Mitch McConnell.
Yes.
The Republicans are campaigning about a Green New Deal. They are setting that up as the straw man opposition about how radical and crazy the Democrats are. We have not fought back effectively at that. We have lost the messaging war over the Green New Deal. I think we can change that once we have the power to actually do legislation and people go through a bill and they see things they like, and we can then say, yeah, we're passing that. And by the way, that was the Green New Deal. So we lost a branding war to the Republicans over the Green New Deal that we've had to adapt to, but the substance of it is something that needs to be done and is virtually, is popular virtually all across the country.
This questioner says, I've read articles that the Chamber of Commerce is in turmoil.
Yeah.
Leftward, albeit still a right-wing organization, and endorsed 23 House Democrats this year for the first time. Is this a signal?
Yes. This is, forgive me for laughing at the misery of the Chamber of Commerce, but they have been my prime antagonist on climate for a long, 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 long time. And I have been battling against them for a long, 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 long time. And with a lot of support from my colleagues, we were able to do things like get hashtag Chamber of Carbon trending over and over again on Twitter, and to brand them as mischief makers and to poke at them over their fossil fuel funding. There's a reason that they were doing what they were doing, and they won't disclose their funding, but when they finally have to, then we'll see it. And we've been after the companies that are chamber members to explain why they're supporting an organization that is so evil when it comes to climate change. This all exploded when a small group, a wonderful group called Influence Map, did a quite authoritative review of who the worst climate obstructors were and put the US Chamber of Commerce in a statistical tie as the worst in America. And at that point, you know, we all piled on again, and the big companies, the Wall Street banks, the consumer-facing companies, even agriculture companies, decided, wait a minute, this is, being part of this organization is doing us more harm than good. So they've been fighting from the inside to try to fix it. The Chamber of Commerce has been dragging its heels and trying to slow walk them and feed them, you know, happy talk. But we're keeping the pressure on. My last two climate speeches on the Senate floor were about the so-called business roundtable. The business roundtable is 200 of the CEOs of America's biggest companies. They just came out for climate action, including a serious price on carbon. At the same time, those same CEOs, like 80 of them, their companies are members of the US Chamber of Commerce, which is adamantly opposed to the things that they say they support. So which voice of yours, American CEOs, do you want us to listen to? Do you want us to listen to your business roundtable voice, which is a little squeak? Or do you want us to listen to your Chamber of Commerce voice, which goes into campaigns and spends money in favor of anti-climate candidates, which goes into courtrooms and sues against climate regulation and legislation, which goes into administrative agencies and fights climate progress, and which is a big obstructor in Congress? Which voice do you want us to listen to? Make up your minds. And that's where viewers can come in to poke at those people. Just look at the companies in my speech and you'll see a ripe target list.
How can we in the next 3 weeks diffuse the Trump-controlled press that even normally educated people have come to believe?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can do that in the next few weeks. I think Fox News and Fox and Friends and the propaganda apparatus that runs through Fox News is a really difficult thing to deal with because of its size and because of its importance in the Republican power structure. And it's also a difficult thing to deal with because as soon as government starts trying to tell news channels what to say and what not to say, you've crossed a pretty dangerous line. So I think calling them out is the best thing. We've watched some of their noisiest voices blow up. They've made themselves look ridiculous on COVID. They've made themselves look ridiculous on climate. Some of them blew up over Me Too issues. I think that, the public debate about what Fox News is up to is probably the best way to deal with it, to hold them accountable for what they say. Dear old Jon Stewart, back when he was running The Daily Show, used to do a wonderful job cranking up Fox News and making fun of them. And I think that's probably the best way to go about it, I'm afraid.
Okay, we've got a legislative reform question here. Why can't we have legislative reform so that individual bills are not tied to other unrelated items? That way, when you see how someone has voted on a bill, you understand what they're voting for or against.
Yeah, I think the packaging of bills together goes way, way back into legislative antiquity. I suspect the Roman Senate packaged bills together to forge coalitions. Right. And coalitions aren't necessarily a bad thing. The problem has been recently that legislation has been shut down partly by the filibuster, partly by the infatuation with judges, partly simply by partisanship and people who come to the Senate to try to disrupt. And the result of that is that there are a couple of really big bills that have to pass every year to fund the military, to keep the government operating for whatever reason. And those big bills then become like a train that everybody wants to get their train car onto because they know that train is leaving the station. And then you have a big quiet battle over getting your bill onto that train. And at the end of the day, there are probably 10 people in a room who decide what's in that bill. It then gets brought out. Everybody else gets told to vote on it with maybe 24 or 48 hours notice. You couldn't read the bill in that little time. And so you find all sorts of tricky, sneaky things in it, like those horrible tax breaks stuck into the COVID bill, for Pete's sake. So the point that the questioner is making is a very good one about how you get a better look at what's in a bill and accountability for it before it's voted on. And there are a bunch of ways to do that.
I can well remember what you're talking about on a lot of omnibus appropriations bills in which it's about Wednesday of the next week that when you begin to read in the New York Times about provisions you had no idea were in there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing that I think there's room to work with, because frankly, there's really bipartisan resentment of that. That's the question where the chairman of major committees and the leadership of both parties go and get in the room and they cut a deal, and they very often take care of themselves and their key constituencies while they're doing it and do favors for home. And everybody else who's not in the room didn't get anything other than, yeah, we had to vote for this bill because otherwise the government would have shut down or COVID would have run rampant. So a better spotlight on what you're voting on is something where I think there'd be bipartisan support.
My old boss, Carl Levin, used to call those bills the big ball of wax.
Yeah.
And just about every year when we got a big major omnibus like that, we'd have a huge debate about whether to vote for it or against it. And I would say, it came out about half the time over the years, about half the time he voted no and argued that it was a horrible way to legislate. And the other half of the time just was persuaded by the weight of all of the things that were in that big appropriations bill that were important to Michigan.
Yeah, and Carl, as the chairman or ranking member of Armed Services, was the gatekeeper, the top gatekeeper of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is one of the absolute must-pass bills that attracts legislators like a dump attracts seagulls, with everybody trying to get their favorite bill into it.
It's the only authorization bill that passes every single year.
Year after year.
And so it becomes, as you say, a terrific vehicle for all sorts of things we used to call Christmas trees.
Including some quite good ones, I will say.
That's right.
It's not all junk that gets in. Some of it is stuff that should pass, deserve to pass, but there were 2 or 3 people on the Senate floor who were quarreling about it, or maybe even only one, and you couldn't get unanimous consent as a result. And so you have to go to a vehicle, and this vehicle was the one that you could work with.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a whole lot of ground tonight, and we've got a minute left. I wanted to give you an opportunity if there was any message that you brought with you in your kind of pocket as you came on tonight. If there's anything you wanted to say in closing, please do.
First, thank you, Rich. It was nice to have some memories of wonderful Carl Levin with you. He really was a very special senator. Thank you to the Taubman Center and to the Watson Institute and to Brown for all the wonderful things you do in Rhode Island. And I guess the closing point that I would make is that very often Democrats run to where the conflict is and engage in whatever the dispute is at the point of conflict. And what we need to learn to be better at is planning ahead and trying to disrupt the planning and sneaky apparatus of the other side. Not wait until there's a confirmation hearing that we object to focus on what's going on with judicial nominations, but to understand that they've spent decades setting this up. And the committee hearing that we're going to have in the next few days is basically a puppet show in a puppet theater. And if everybody just looks at the puppet show in the puppet theater, they miss the important part, which is who's outside of the puppet theater pulling the strings and making the marionettes dance. And that is an area where we need to pay a lot more attention.
And with that, thank you so much for joining us tonight, honoring us with this program tonight. And thank you for everything you do for the state of Rhode Island and for the nation.
It's my honor. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.